Welcome to the Stellar Vault. Say hi in the comments to awaken the archive. Then like, subscribe, and let the tale begin.
The room smelled like recycled air stripped of everything. 30 days of it. 30 days of copper-tinted air, fluorescent strips that never dimmed, and walls made of a metal that didn't exist on any periodic table Milo Vasek had ever studied. He'd stopped counting the hours after the first week. Time didn't work the same way on holding station Ureth 7. There were no windows, no sun, no night. Just the hum of the station's circulatory systems pushing dead air through dead corridors, and the occasional click of Dothari boots on grated flooring. They'd finally gotten around to him. The interrogation room was identical to his cell, except for the table, bolted down, some kind of composite alloy. 2 seats on one side, one on the other. Vasek sat in the one. His compliance band pulsed a faint blue on his left wrist. Overseer Kravik entered like a man visiting inventory, which Vasek supposed he was. Kravik was tall, even for a Dothari. The species ran lean and rigid, scaled skin the color of wet slate, eyes set wide and unblinking. No pupils, just flat amber discs that tracked movement with mechanical precision. His uniform was immaculate, pressed. Rank insignia aligned to the millimeter. Everything about him said, "I manage systems. Systems do not fail." Behind Kravik, a junior officer set down a tablet and stepped back against the wall. Kravik sat. The translation lattice behind his ear caught the light, a small crescent of dark metal. Standard issue. Every officer wore one. All prisoners, too. It flattened all speech into Dotek, the Empire's administrative language. Clean, hierarchical, stripped of everything that made language worth speaking. Kravik tapped the tablet without looking up. Prisoner intake designation Ureth, 74421. Species, human. Classification, non-combat. Diplomatic auxiliary. Detained during border interception. Vessel Adara. 31 standard rotations ago. He looked up. "You are Milo Vasek." It wasn't a question. The Dothari didn't ask questions. They made requests for clarification, or they stated facts and waited for confirmation. The linguistic difference was everything. "I am," Vasek said. "In Dotek." Kravik's jaw shifted. A micro-movement, the Dothari equivalent of a raised eyebrow. The lattice translated words, not fluency. But Vasek wasn't speaking through the lattice. He was speaking Dothek directly. Clean grammar, correct tonal register, proper caste-neutral phrasing, which was itself a subtle achievement. Most non-Dothari couldn't even identify the caste layers embedded in the language, let alone navigate around them. "You speak Dothek," Kravik said. "I was a diplomatic linguist, attached to Earth's First Contact Bureau. Language acquisition is what I do." "How many languages?" 6 fluent, several more at functional level. Kravik processed this the way he processed everything, as data. He noted it on his tablet. A linguist, non-combat, cooperative, no flags. "Your crew members were redistributed to appropriate facilities based on their military classifications," Kravik said. "You were retained here due to your civilian status. You are considered low priority." "I understand. Do you have any requests for clarification regarding your detention?" Vasek paused. "Not long, just enough to feel natural." "Apenas uma," he said. "Just one, Portuguese." Soft. Rounded, warm, the kind of language that curled at the edges like smoke. He buried it inside a Dothek sentence structure, slid it in where the lattice expected a standard Dothek modifier. The device behind his ear hummed for a fraction of a second, processed the input, found no Dothek match, and did exactly what it was designed to do. It discarded the word as noise. Kravik didn't flinch. His amber eyes stayed flat and expectant. He hadn't heard it because, As far as his lattice was concerned, it hadn't been said. Vasek completed the sentence in clean Dothic. How long is the standard detention period for my classification? Kravik answered. Something about review cycles and administrative timelines. Vasek didn't care about the answer. He'd already gotten what he needed. The crack was real. The yard was a pressurized chamber roughly the size of a warehouse loading bay, somewhere in the station's mid-ring. No sky, no horizon, just a vaulted ceiling of gray composite paneling and light strips that cast everything in a flat, shadowless white. The floor was the same grated metal as everywhere else. It rang hollow when you walked on it. 400 prisoners, give or take. 6 species, maybe more. All of them here, because the Dothari Empire had decided their worlds were worth taking, and their people were worth sorting. Vasek stood near the wall during his first yard rotation and did what he did best. He watched. The Brevari clustered in a tight knot near the far corner. Small, rodent-featured, nervous by biology. They communicated in rapid chirps that the lattice mashed into flat Dothek monotone, stripping every emotional register. They looked like they were always on the edge of panic. Maybe they were. The Tessic stood alone. 3 of them, spaced apart. Tall, silicon-laced skin that caught the light in dull flashes. Nearly mute by nature. Their native communication was partly chemical, partly subsonic. The lattice gave them almost nothing. They existed in the station like statues that occasionally moved. And the Vaughn. The Vaughn sat in rows. Not by choice, Vasek suspected. By habit. Former hive mind species. The Dothari had destroyed their queen nodes 2 generations ago, severing the neural link that had connected their entire civilization. Now they were individuals, unwillingly, unequipped. They'd lost their shared language along with their shared consciousness, and the Dothek they'd been forced to learn sat in their mouths like stones. Nobody talked to each other. 6 species in a room, and the silence was deafening. Not because they had nothing to say, because they had no way to say it. The lattice made sure of that. It translated everything into the same flat, functional Dothek, and in doing so, it killed every conversation before it started. You can't build trust in a language designed for compliance reports. Vasek saw the architecture immediately. It wasn't a prison held together by walls and shock bands. It was a prison held together by isolation, by the inability to communicate anything real. The Dothari hadn't just conquered these species, they'd stolen their tongues. And they hadn't even done it on purpose. That was the part that fascinated him. The lattice wasn't designed to suppress. It was designed to standardize. The Dothari genuinely believed that converting all speech into Dothek was a service, efficiency, clarity, order. They couldn't conceive of what they'd destroyed in the process. Vasek went to the yard 3 days in a row and spoke to no one. On the first day, he sat against the wall near the Vaughn section. Not close, just present. On the second day, he sat in the same spot. Rilek, the big one, the deserter, glanced at him once. Vasek didn't return the look. On the third day, Rilek spoke. "You are the human." His Dothek was rough, fractured grammar. The lattice smoothed the worst of it, but the strain was audible underneath. Every sentence cost him effort. "I am," Vasek said. "You sit here. You do not speak." "No." "Why?" The word hung in the air. It was technically improper Dothek. The language didn't frame inquiries that way. But Rilek didn't care. He'd never fully learned the rules, and he'd stopped trying. Vasek turned to look at him. Rilek was large by Vaughn standards. His carapace was dark, ridged along the shoulders, cracked in places that suggested old violence. His eyes were compound, fractured light behind dark lenses. His mandibles moved slightly when he was thinking. He looked like something that could tear a man apart. He also looked like something that had been taken apart himself. Slowly. Over years. "Because I wanted to hear you first," Vasek said. Rilek went quiet, his mandibles stilled. Then, after a long pause, "There is nothing to hear." But there was. Vasek had been listening for 3 days, not to what Rilek said, but to what the lattice couldn't carry. The hesitations, the places where Rilek reached for a word that didn't exist in Dotek. The moments of silence that weren't empty, but full, loaded with something the administrative language of an empire had no category for. Grief, loss, the specific, bone-deep ache of missing something you can never return to. "There's a word," Vasek said, "in one of my languages. It doesn't translate. Not into Dotek, not into most human languages either. It's—" He paused, choosing his framing carefully. "It means the feeling of missing something that was part of you. Not just gone. Taken. And you carry the absence like it still has weight." Rilek's compound eyes shifted. His mandibles parted slightly. "Saudade," Vasek said. The lattice processed, found no Dotek equivalent, logged it as noise, discarded it, but Rilek heard it. Not through the lattice, through the air between them, the raw sound of it, the shape of the vowels, the way it fell, soft and heavy at the same time. "Saudade," Rilek repeated. His mandibles shaped the word differently, harder at the edges, deeper in the middle, but it was recognizable. It was the first word he'd spoken in years that wasn't Dotek. "What does the machine say?" Rilek asked. "Nothing," Vasek said. "The machine doesn't know it exists." Something changed behind Rilek's eyes. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of a man who'd just been handed back a single, tiny piece of what had been stolen from him. A word the Empire couldn't hear. Night rotation on Ureth 7 was a dimming of the overhead strips by roughly 30%. That was it. The station didn't sleep. The air recyclers didn't sleep. The compliance bands didn't sleep. But the guards rotated to skeleton shifts, and the corridors went from sterile to ghostly. Sergeant Tosk walked cell block 4 the way he'd walked it for 11 rotations. Steady, mechanical. His boots hit the grating in a rhythm so consistent you could set a clock by it. Click, click, click. Pause at each cell. Scan. Move on. He was not a bad officer. He was not a good one. He was a function. Tosk performed his duties because that was what the caste system required of him. Military caste, mid-rank, no pathway to promotion, no ambition left to fuel one. He maintained. He reported. He endured. He did not think about whether he was lonely, because the Dathari language didn't have a clean word for it. There was isolation, a logistical state. There was reduction of social function, a medical term. But loneliness, the human kind, the kind that sits in your chest like a low hum you can't locate, that didn't exist in Dothek, which didn't mean Tosk didn't feel it. Vasek was sitting up when Tosk reached his cell, back against the wall, eyes open, the compliance band's blue glow the only color in the dark. Tosk paused. Prisoners were usually horizontal during dim cycle. This one never was. "You are awake," Tosk said. Statement, not question. "I am. This is outside normal behavioral patterns for your species. I don't sleep well in places where the air tastes like copper." Tosk's head tilted. A micro-movement. Dathari didn't understand humor delivered deadpan. Their communication was too literal for subtext. But something in the phrasing caught him. Not the joke, the casualness. Prisoners didn't speak to guards casually. They spoke in compliance phrases, yes sir patterns, rote acknowledgement. This human talked like Tosk was just another person standing in a hallway. "I have a request for clarification," Vasek said. "Proper phrasing. Correct register." Tosk nodded. "Go ahead." "How many rotations have you served on this station?" Tosk almost answered immediately, then stopped. The question was procedurally acceptable, framed correctly, non-threatening, within the bounds of what a prisoner could request clarification on. But it felt different. It was aimed at him, not at his role. At him, 11 standard rotations, Tosk said. "That's a long assignment. It is within normal parameters for my rank and caste placement." "Of course," Vasek said. "I meant no challenge to the system. I simply observed that 11 rotations in one station is a significant duration. The routine must become familiar." Tosk stood very still. His amber eyes were unreadable by human standards, but the lattice wasn't carrying this conversation to anyone. Night shift, empty corridor, just 2 voices and the hum of the station. "It is consistent," Tosk said. "Yes," Vasek said. "Consistent." He let the words sit, didn't push, didn't ask another question. Just let the silence fill the space between them with something that felt, for the first time in a long time, almost like company. Tosk lingered 4 seconds longer than protocol allowed. Then he moved on. Click, click, click. But he came back the next night. And the night after that, 12 days after Vasek taught Rilek the word, he heard it in the meal line. Not from Rilek, from a brevari. The small creature was pressed shoulder to shoulder with 3 others of its kind, shuffling forward in the dispensary queue. One of them chirped something rapid and anxious. The lattice flattened it into a bland Dothek status report. But the second one, the one closest to the Vaughn section, turned to a companion and said, very quietly, "Saudade." The lattice hummed, processed, found nothing, logged as noise, discarded. Vasek collected his ration tray and walked to his usual spot. He ate slowly. The protein block tasted like chalk mixed with obligation, but he chewed it methodically, watching the room without watching the room. The word had jumped. He hadn't taught the brevari. Rilek had. Or maybe another Vaughn had learned it from Rilek and passed it down the line. It didn't matter. What mattered was the mechanism. Language didn't spread through instruction. It spread through need. Someone heard a word that named something they felt but couldn't express, and they kept it, passed it on. Not because they were told to, because they had to. Saudade was alive now, moving through the population like water through cracks in stone, and the lattice, the Dothari Empire's great standardizing engine, was deaf to it. Back in his cell, Vasek allowed himself something he hadn't permitted in 30 days, a smile, small, brief, the kind that didn't reach the eyes but lived in the corners of the mouth where plans were kept. One word, one invisible word in a prison of 400, and the architecture was already shifting. Not the walls, not the guards, not the shock bands. The architecture underneath, the one made of silence and separation, the one that actually held this place together. He was still sitting with that thought when the shadow fell across his cell door. Sub-Warden Drell was leaner than Kravik, younger, with scales that ran darker along the jaw. His uniform was regulation, but he wore it like a weapon, not a costume. Where Kravik managed, Drell watched. He'd been watching for 9 days. Vasek knew because he'd been counting the appearances, the figure at the edge of the yard, the boots that paused 2 seconds too long outside his cell, the amber eyes that tracked him during meal rotations. Drell was not bored like Tosk. He was not mechanical like Kravik. He was the kind of officer who didn't know exactly what was wrong, but trusted the instinct that something was. He stood at the cell door, said nothing for a full 5 seconds. Let the silence do its work. Then, "You talk too much for a man with nothing to say." Vasek looked up at him, calm, unhurried. The compliance band pulsed blue on his wrist. "I appreciate the clarification, Sub-Warden." Drell's eyes narrowed. Not anger, calculation. He turned and walked away, his boots sharp on the grating. Click, click, click. A different rhythm than Tosk's. Faster, purposeful. Vasek listened until the sound disappeared. Then he closed his eyes and began composing his next word. Drell moved Vasek to cell 7, 19 on the 6th day after their first exchange. No explanation. No formal reclassification. Just 2 guards at morning dispensary who redirected him down a different corridor and pointed at an open door. The new cell was identical to the old one. Same dimensions, same grated floor, same dead light, except for its position, directly across from the Block 4 monitoring alcove. Whoever sat at that station could see straight into Vasek's cell without turning their head. Vasek set down his ration tray on the shelf, looked at the monitoring alcove, looked at the angle of sight. Understood. Drell wasn't punishing him. He was putting him under glass. Good. Glass works both ways. The increased scrutiny arrived in layers. A second daily check during dim cycle. Drell himself, not a subordinate. Yard rotation monitored from the elevated observation platform instead of the floor. Vasek's meal position logged and tracked. None of it was outside protocol. All of it was a message. Vasek received the message and changed nothing about his behavior. He sat in the yard. He ate his rations. He slept during dim cycle, or appeared to. He spoke to no one. He didn't need to. The network was already built. Rilek had understood the mechanism before Vasek ever explained it. The Vaughn had lost their hive mind, but they hadn't lost the instinct for it. The deep, biological pull toward shared consciousness. Give a Vaughn a word that carried collective meaning, and he didn't just learn it. He distributed it. Not deliberately, reflexively, the way a severed nerve still fires. Rilek passed words to the Vaughn during yard rotations, shoulder to shoulder, mandibles barely moving, sounds that the lattice flagged as subvocal noise and threw away. The Vaughn passed them to the brevari. The small ones were everywhere, always clustered, always nervous, and they picked up language like sponges because their survival instinct was built on reading every signal in the room. The brevari passed them to whoever would listen. Vasek never spoke to anyone new. He didn't approach. He didn't recruit. He sat against his wall in the yard and watched the architecture reshape itself in real time. Drell watched from the platform above and saw a man doing nothing. The lattice confirmed it. The second word took 11 days to choose. Vasek considered and discarded dozens. He needed something specific, not just a word without a Dotek equivalent. There were thousands of those. He needed a word that would do structural work. Saudade had named a feeling. It had given the prisoners permission to grieve in a language the Empire couldn't monitor. That was the foundation. But you couldn't build a house on grief alone. He needed a word that meant community, but not the Dothek version. Their word for community was administrative, a unit of organization. Bodies counted and assigned. He needed something that meant belonging by choice, identity through connection. The idea that you existed more fully because of the people around you, and they existed more fully because of you. He gave Rilek Ubuntu. They were in the yard, sitting in their usual configuration, close enough to speak, far enough apart to look unconnected. The observation platform was manned, not by Drell today, but by a rotation officer who was already bored 9 minutes into his shift. A new word, Vasek said. Low, direct, embedded in a Dotek sentence about ration quality that the lattice processed and found unremarkable. "Speak it," Rillick said. His Dotek had improved over the weeks, but he'd started doing something Vasek hadn't anticipated, mixing the human words into his speech patterns naturally, the way a river absorbs tributaries. His sentences were becoming hybrid things. Dothek structure, carrying human meaning. "Ubuntu," Vasek said. "It comes from a language family in the southern regions of my world. It means, I am because we are." Rilek's compound eyes shifted. His mandibles worked the sound. "Ubuntu." "Close enough. I am because we are," Rillick repeated. Not translating, tasting it. The Vaughn had this. Before. I know. Silence. The yard hummed with 400 bodies and no real conversation. Except here. Except in the gap between two prisoners that the lattice had written off as dead air. "This word," Rillick said. "It is a weapon." "It's a greeting," Vasek said. Rillick looked at him. The compound eyes caught the flat overhead light and fractured it into something that, in a different context, might have been amusement. "A greeting," Rillick repeated. "It took 8 days. By the 4th day, Vasek heard a Vaughn use it in the meal line. By the 6th, a brevari. On the 8th day, something happened that Vasek hadn't planned, but had hoped for. A Tessic said it. The Tessic were nearly mute. Their communication was chemical and subsonic. The lattice gave them almost nothing, and they gave the lattice even less. They moved through the station like ghosts made of stone. No one spoke to them. They spoke to no one. But one of them, tall, silicon-laced skin, dull under the fluorescence, turned to a Vaughn in the yard and said in a voice like gravel shifting in a dry riverbed, "Ubuntu." The Vaughn responded in kind. The lattice caught both utterances, found no Dotek match, and discarded them. Two species that had never exchanged a word in the history of this station had just greeted each other in a language that belonged to neither of them. A human language. Carried through a network the Empire couldn't see, speaking words the Empire couldn't hear. The Tower of Babel was rebuilding itself, and the architects were deaf to the sound of construction. Tosk came to Cell 7, 19 on the 14th night after the move. He almost hadn't. Vasek could tell by the hesitation in his footsteps. The rhythm broke 6 meters out. Click, click, pause, click, then steady again, but slower. Tosk was arguing with himself. The new cell's position across from the monitoring alcove made these visits visible to anyone reviewing the surveillance logs. Tosk knew that. He came anyway. "You have been relocated," Tosk said. Standing at the cell door, not entering. Protocol allowed corridor conversation during wellness checks, but not cell entry during dim cycle. I noticed. Subwarden Drell authorized the transfer, I assumed. Tosk stood there. The amber discs of his eyes caught the dim cycle lighting and turned them from flat gold to something darker, almost warm. His posture was regulation, spine straight, hands clasped behind his back. But his weight had shifted to one foot. A lean, casual, undothari. 3 weeks of conversation had done that. Not conversations, really. Exchanges. Tosk would ask about human customs, framed as requests for clarification about prisoner behavioral patterns. Vasek would answer, then redirect. Gently. Never pushing. Always listening more than he spoke. He learned that Tosk had entered military caste at adolescence, that his placement score had been average. That average meant permanent mid-rank. That permanent mid-rank on a station like Ureth 7 meant you were furniture, useful, maintained, never considered. Tosk had never questioned this. Questioning wasn't something the Dothari did. Their language didn't support it. Not really. You could request clarification. You could flag discrepancies. But the kind of questioning that humans did, the kind that started with why and didn't accept because the system as an answer, that mechanism didn't exist in Dothek. Which didn't mean the feeling didn't exist. It just had no name. "I have a request for clarification," Vasek said. "Proceed. In Dothek, is there a term for the experience of fulfilling one's assigned function without receiving corresponding recognition or advancement?" Tosk processed. His jaw shifted. The micro-movement Vasek had learned to read as thought. "There is diminished operational return," Tosk said, "an efficiency metric for systems that consume resources without proportional output." "That's a term for a machine," Vasek said. "I'm asking about a person." Tosk went still. Not frozen. Still. The difference mattered. Frozen was surprise. Still was the moment before something changes. "There is no such term," Tosk said. "I see," Vasek said. "There isn't." He let the silence hold. 2 seconds. 3. Then, "There's a name from human history. Sisyphus. Not a word. A story. A story. A man condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain. Every time he reached the top, the boulder rolled back down. He had to start again. Forever." Tosk didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Vasek with an intensity that went beyond standard surveillance. "The punishment was not the labor," Vasek continued. "The punishment was the knowledge that the labor would never matter. The mountain would never be conquered. The system would never acknowledge the effort. He was not serving a purpose. He was serving a structure." The corridor hummed. Recycled air pushed through the vents. Somewhere in the distance, the station's circulatory systems clicked through their eternal cycle. "This is a story from your species," Tosk said. His voice was different, quieter. The official register had dropped away, replaced by something Vasek had never heard from him before, something unmediated. "It's a story from my species," Vasek confirmed, "but I've noticed it translates." Tosk stood at the cell door for 11 seconds beyond protocol. Vasek counted. Then the sergeant left. Click, 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 but slower. Like a man walking a path he'd walked 1,000 times, and suddenly noticing it led nowhere. He came back the next night and asked to hear another story. Drell found the thread on a Tuesday. Not that Urith 7 had Tuesdays. But Vasek had been keeping a private calendar in his head since arrival. Old habit, human habit, the kind of small defiance that kept the mind anchored. And by his count, it was a Tuesday when the sub-warden pulled the audio logs. Standard procedure allowed supervisory staff to review surveillance recordings from any block under their jurisdiction. Drell had the authority. What he didn't have until now was a reason to look at them closely. The logs were clean. Every recorded conversation in Cell Block 4 was Dothek. Compliant, unremarkable. Prisoner exchanges about rations, schedules, physical complaints. Guard communications limited to status reports and compliance checks. The lattice had processed every syllable and found nothing outside parameters. But Drell wasn't looking at the words. He was looking at the gaps. 9 days of observation had taught him what the lattice couldn't. The human changed rooms. Not physically, energetically. When Vasek was in the yard, prisoners moved differently. The clustering patterns shifted. Species that kept to themselves drifted closer to others. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would trigger a behavioral flag. But Drell had spent 6 rotations studying population dynamics on detention platforms, and he knew what organic social restructuring looked like. It looked like this. He pulled the audio logs from the yard for the past 20 days, ran them through the lattice's standard filter. Clean. All Dothek. Then he ran a secondary pass. Not content analysis, but acoustic mapping. frequency, duration, distribution of vocal activity. The pattern was immediate. Pockets of non-dothec vocalization, flagged and discarded as noise by the lattice, clustered around specific coordinates in the yard. The densest cluster mapped to the human's habitual position along the western wall. But the clusters weren't static. They radiated. Day by day, the noise pockets migrated outward, appearing in new locations at greater distances from the origin point. Drell stared at the acoustic map on his display. The visualization looked like a stone dropped in water, concentric rings expanding outward from a single point. The human. He couldn't decode the noise. The lattice was structurally incapable of it. Anything outside its dothec parameters was processed as non-linguistic data and purged. He couldn't prove the noise was language. He couldn't prove it carried meaning. All he had was a pattern. But patterns were enough. He took it to Kravik. The overseer's office was on the administrative level, one floor above the cell blocks, separated by a security partition and a caste distinction that was just as thick. Kravik sat behind a curved desk made of the same composite alloy as everything else on the station. His tablet was centered precisely. His rank insignia gleamed. Drell laid out the acoustic data, the clustering, the radiation pattern, the correlation with the human's position and movement. Kravik looked at the display for 6 seconds. "This is noise," Kravik said. "This is structured noise. It has a point of origin and a pattern of dispersal consistent with communicative behavior. The lattice classifies it as non-linguistic. The lattice classifies it as non-dothec. That is not the same thing." Kravik's amber eyes flattened, a superior being corrected by a subordinate. The caste dynamics of the moment were as rigid as the language that enforced them. Drell had overstepped, not in content, in register. He'd spoken to Kravik as an equal, and in dothec, that was audible. "Subwarden," Kravik said. The title was a correction, not an address. The station houses 400 prisoners across 6 species. Acoustic anomalies are a statistical certainty. The lattice is functioning within normal parameters. I see no evidence of a security concern. Overseer, the human. The human is a non-combat civilian linguist, classified as low priority. He has committed no infractions. He has triggered no behavioral flags. He is, by every measurable standard, a model detainee. Drell stood very still. His jaw tightened, a Dothari expression of controlled disagreement that was permissible between ranks, but barely. "I request authorization for enhanced interrogation of the prisoner." Denied. Resource allocation for enhanced interrogation requires documented evidence of a security threat. You have presented acoustic noise patterns. That is insufficient. Drell looked at Kravik for a long moment. The overseer had already returned his attention to his tablet. The conversation was over. In dothec, when a superior stopped speaking, the silence was a command. "Leave." Drell left. He stood in the corridor outside Kravik's office. The light strips hummed their flat, constant hum. The air tasted like copper and procedure. Kravik was wrong. Drell knew it the way a predator knows movement in the grass, not through logic, but through something older. Something the Dothari caste system had spent generations trying to breed out of the military rank and file, because instinct was inefficient and protocol was not. The system wouldn't help him. The system couldn't see what was happening because it had been designed by people who believed language was transparent, who believed words were containers for fact and nothing else, who had built an empire on the certainty that if you controlled the language, you controlled the thought. They had never met a species that understood language as a living thing, a thing with roots and branches and seeds that could be planted in silence and grow in the dark. Drell straightened his uniform, pulled his jaw tight, made a decision. If the system wouldn't act, he would. Drell came for him during the dead hours. No escort request filed, no transfer authorization logged. Just the sub-warden and 2 guards Vasek hadn't seen before, young, tight-jawed, the kind of military caste that followed orders without the inconvenience of understanding them. They pulled him from cell 7, 19 without a word, compliance band already switched from standby to active, and marched him down a corridor he'd never walked. Left at the junction where Block 4 met the maintenance ring, down a ramp, through a pressure door that required Drell's personal authorization code, into a section of the station that smelled different, older, colder, like metal that hadn't been walked on in years. Secondary processing room 3. No surveillance indicators on the ceiling. No lattice relay mounted on the wall. Whatever happened in this room happened off the record, which meant it happened at Drell's discretion, which meant it didn't happen at all. The guards positioned Vasek in the single chair, wrists on the armrests, compliance band visible. Then they left. The pressure door sealed behind them. Drell stood across the table. He didn't sit. "I will not frame this as a request for clarification," Drell said. "I am not requesting anything." Vasek said nothing. The acoustic patterns in Block 4 and the general population yard show a consistent, expanding distribution of non-Dothek vocalizations originating from your position and radiating outward through the prisoner population over a period of approximately 40 days. The lattice is the Empire's nervous system, but it cannot decode these vocalizations. I am not the lattice. I can see what you're doing. Drell placed both hands on the table, leaned forward. His scales caught the overhead light, darker along the jaw, just like the first time they'd met. His amber eyes were flat and focused. You are teaching them something. I do not know what. But I know it started with you, and I know it is spreading, and I know that anything a prisoner works this hard to hide from us is a threat. Vasek met his gaze. Calm. The same calm he'd carried since the first interrogation with Kravik. The calm that wasn't peace but patience. The kind that came from knowing exactly how long a fuse was and exactly when it would reach the powder. "Sub-Warden," Vasek said, "I'm a civilian linguist classified as low priority. I've committed no infractions. I've triggered no behavioral flags. I am, by every measurable standard, a model detainee." Kravik's words, thrown back with surgical precision. Drell recognized them. His jaw tightened. "You are quoting the Overseer." "I'm quoting the system you serve." Drell hit the compliance band. Pain setting. Not warning. Pain. The band activated with a sound like a wasp trapped in glass, and Vasek's left arm seized from wrist to shoulder. The current was designed to overload peripheral nerve clusters without causing permanent damage. Efficient. Clean. The Datari approach to suffering. Measurable. Calibrated. Deniable. Vasek's teeth locked. His vision whited at the edges. He didn't scream. The sound that escaped was a hard exhale, pushed through a closed throat. His right hand gripped the armrest until the tendons stood out like cables. 3 seconds. Drell released. Vasek's breathing came back in stages, ragged, then controlled, then steady. He raised his head. His eyes were wet but focused. "That's your method," Vasek said. His voice was thin but even. "Pain. Direct input, expected output. Very Dothari. Tell me what you are teaching them." "Words." "What words?" "Words you don't have." Drell hit the band again. 5 seconds this time. Vasek's body locked rigid in the chair, every muscle firing against itself. When it stopped, he slumped forward. A thin line of blood ran from where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. He spat red onto the composite floor. Looked up. "You can keep doing this," Vasek said, "but you've already lost. You are one prisoner, in a chair, bleeding. Yes, and the words are already out there, in 400 mouths, in 6 species, spreading every time someone in that yard opens their mouth. You can't take them back. You can't decode them. You can't even hear them. Vasek leaned forward, blood on his teeth. You put me in this chair because you think I'm the source, and I was. But a source only matters before the river exists. The river exists now, Sub-Warden, and you can't interrogate a river. Drell stared at him for a long time. The room was silent except for the hum of the station's bones. Then he called the guards and had Vasek return to general population. The yard knew before Vasek arrived. Prison information networks were faster than light. A Bravari had seen the guards pull Vasek during dead hours. Another had tracked the direction, maintenance ring, downward. A Vaughn had noted the duration of absence. By the time Vasek walked into the yard for morning rotation, every prisoner in the room had already assembled the picture. The human had been taken. The human had been hurt. The human had been returned. Vasek moved slowly. His left arm hung at his side, the compliance band now back on standby, but the nerve damage still singing. The blood on his cheek had been wiped, but the swelling hadn't gone down. He walked to his usual position along the western wall and sat. Rilek was already there. The Vaughn looked at Vasek's arm, at his face. His compound eyes fractured the light into something hard and dark. Drell, Rilek said. Not a question. Yes. What did you tell him? The truth. That it's too late. Rilek's mandibles parted, then closed. He turned to the Vaughn sitting in the row behind him and spoke a single word. Not Dothik. The word passed down the row. Vaughn to Vaughn. Then across the gap to a cluster of Bravari. Then from the Bravari to the 3 Tessek standing like sentinels near the north wall. Ubuntu. Spoken at full volume. Not whispered. Not hidden. Declared. A Bravari near the dispensary queue turned and set it to a Vaughn he'd never spoken to before. The Vaughn replied with Sodede. A Tessek, the tall one with the cracked silicon skin, rumbled the word so deep it vibrated in the floor grating. The lattice relay mounted on the yard ceiling processed the incoming audio. Hundreds of vocalizations, overlapping, rising. It ran each one through its Dothek filter. Failed to match. Flagged as noise. Discarded. Flagged. Discarded. Flagged. Discarded. The system had been designed to handle anomalies as exceptions. 1 piece of noise was a glitch. 10 were a minor log entry. 400 simultaneous non-Dothek vocalizations from every corner of the yard was something the lattice had no protocol for. The monitoring station in the observation platform began scrolling error flags faster than the duty officer could read them. The guards on the yard floor looked at each other. The prisoners weren't fighting, weren't resisting, weren't breaking any regulation that had a name. They were standing, sitting, moving through their normal rotations. But they were speaking, all of them, in something that wasn't Dothek, and wasn't any recognized prisoner language, and wasn't silence. It was a sound the station had never heard before. 400 voices from 6 species, sharing words that belonged to a 7th. A language built not from grammar books or conquest, but from grief and connection, and the simple, devastating act of naming what the Empire had no name for. The guards heard noise. The prisoners heard each other. Drell called the lockdown 14 minutes after the yard erupted. Emergency protocol. All prisoners confined to cells. Movement corridors sealed. Guard units mobilized to full strength. The station's alarm system, a low, pulsing tone that resonated through the metal walls like a heartbeat, filled every corridor. Kravik was in the command center within 3 minutes. He looked at the monitoring feeds, saw prisoners walking calmly to their cells, saw no violence, no resistance, no barricades. Explain, Kravik said. The prison is compromised, Drell said. The human linguist has constructed a communication network across the entire general population, using non-Dothek vocabulary that the translation lattice cannot process. Every species in the facility is now using this vocabulary openly. Our monitoring systems are blind to the content. Kravik stared at the feeds. On 6 screens, prisoners filed into their cells without incident, compliant, orderly, speaking words that scrolled across the lattice readout as error, non-recognized vocalization, discarded. "They are obeying the lockdown," Kravik said. "They are obeying the lockdown in a language we cannot understand. The compliance is irrelevant. The communication is the threat." Kravik processed. His amber eyes moved across the screens. For the first time since Vasek had arrived on the station, the overseer looked uncertain. Not afraid. The Dothari didn't have a clean word for that either, but destabilized. The system was functioning. Prisoners were compliant. No metrics had been violated. And yet, "Suppression authorized," Kravik said. "Isolate the human. Transfer to solitary containment." Drell was already moving. Guard units deployed to cell block 4. 8 officers. Full compliance band authorization. Pain and incapacitation settings unlocked. Standard suppression formation. 2 point, 4 flank, 2 rear. Military cast efficiency. Sergeant Tosk was assigned to point position. He walked the corridor he'd walked 1,000 times. Click. 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 The same rhythm, the same grating under his boots, the same dead light overhead. But the sound in the corridor was different now. From every cell, behind every door, a low murmur. Not shouting, not chanting, just speaking. Human words in alien mouths, steady as breathing. Inside cell 7. 19. Vasek sat against the wall. His left arm was cradled in his lap, the compliance band pulsing blue. He looked up when the formation stopped at his door. 8 guards. Full authorization. Tosk at the front, hand on his compliance trigger. Vasek looked at him. Just at him. Not at the formation. Not at the weapons. At the man who'd spent weeks walking this corridor and stopping at this door. The man who'd listened to stories about boulders and mountains and systems that consumed without returning. One word. Sisyphus. Tosk's hand was on the trigger. His duty was clear. His orders were specific. His caste, his rank, his 11 rotations of service, all of it pointed in one direction. The boulder was at the bottom of the mountain. He was supposed to push it up again. Tosk's hand dropped. He stepped to the side of the corridor, pressed his back against the wall. Said nothing. Did nothing. Became, for the first time in 11 rotations, something the Dothari system had no classification for. A man who stopped. The formation hesitated. The 6 flanking guards looked at their point officer, standing against the wall with his arms at his sides. The rear guards waited for a command that didn't come. 7 seconds of silence. An eternity in military time. Then the second guard in formation lowered his trigger hand, not because he understood, because hesitation is contagious in a way that protocol can never account for. Drell came himself. He rounded the corner of Block 4's main corridor at speed, boots sharp on the grating, compliance trigger in hand, set to incapacitation. Behind him, 3 additional officers. He saw Tosk against the wall, saw the stalled formation, read the situation in half a second, and didn't waste time on it. He walked straight to cell 7, 19. But the corridor had changed. Prisoners stood at their cell doors, not outside. The lockdown barriers held them inside the threshold, but they stood. Vaughn, shoulder to shoulder. Carapaces dark under the emergency lighting. Bravari clustered 3 and 4 deep, small eyes catching the alarm pulse. 2 Tessic, tall enough that their heads nearly touched the corridor ceiling, silicon skin reflecting red. None of them moved. None of them reached. None of them violated a single regulation. They spoke, a low, continuous sound, Ubuntu, saudade, and other words. Vasek had given Rilek more than 2, and Rilek had distributed them all. Meraki, Komorebi, Tosca, Higa. Words from Portuguese, Greek, Japanese, Russian, Danish. Words that named the spaces between what empires could measure. Words for the light through leaves, for the ache of creative love, for the warmth of a room where you belong. The lattice screamed noise. Every relay in the corridor maxed its error buffer and dumped to overflow. The monitoring system, designed to process language as Dothek and discard everything else, was drowning, not in rebellion, in vocabulary. Drell raised the compliance trigger and fired at Vasek. Incapacitation setting, full discharge. Vasek's body seized and dropped. He hit the cell floor hard, left arm folding under him. The compliance band overloaded its neural circuit, and the blue light went red, then dark. He lay on the grating, breathing in short, broken pulls. Blood from his cheek wound reopened and spread in a thin line across the metal. Rilek stepped forward. The lockdown barrier on his cell had been opened from the inside, a mechanical failure that wasn't a failure at all. The Vaughn were engineers by biological inclination. Their hive mind hadn't just been communication, it had been infrastructure. Rilek had been taking the station apart in his head since the first week. He stood between Drell and Vasek's cell. Full height, carapace ridged and dark, compound eyes catching the emergency lighting and turning it into something that looked like rage, but was older than that. Deeper, a second Vaughn stepped out, then a third. A Bravari slipped through a gap in a lockdown barrier that shouldn't have had a gap. One of the Tessic placed a hand, massive, silicon-dense, heavy as stone, on the corridor wall. The metal groaned. Drell looked at the corridor, at the prisoners standing in it, at the ones still in their cells, speaking, at the monitoring system scrolling errors it would never resolve, at his guards frozen behind him. "This is insurrection," Drell said. Rilek looked down at him. The Vaughn had 8 inches and 40 kilos on the subwarden. His mandibles parted, and he spoke in a voice that carried the full depth of a species that had once shared a single mind. "This is a conversation." Drell turned. Kravik was at the end of the corridor. The overseer had come down from the command level, something he hadn't done in rotations. He stood at the junction where Block 4 met the main ring, amber eyes scanning the scene with the expression of a man watching his inventory reclassify itself. Prisoners in the corridor, guards frozen, monitoring systems blind, and a sound everywhere, from every direction, from every cell and every throat, that his empire had no mechanism to understand. Vasek pushed himself off the floor. It took time. His left arm was dead from the compliance band overload, and his right hand shook as he braced against the wall. Blood on his chin, swelling closing his left eye. He got to his feet the way a man gets to his feet when falling down is no longer an option. He looked at Kravik, across 30 meters of corridor, past Rilek, past Drell, past the guards who'd forgotten what they were guarding. Kravik stared back. "What have you done?" the overseer said. Vasek's voice was quiet, steady, wrecked, but clear. "I gave them words you couldn't hear, and they gave each other something you couldn't take." Kravik stood in the corridor of his own station and, for the first time in his administrative career, had no response. Not because he chose silence, because the language he spoke, the language his empire was built on, did not contain the words for what he was witnessing. The alarm pulsed. The lattice scrolled errors. 400 voices spoke in a tongue that did not exist within any Dothari register, built from the borrowed fragments of a small blue world the Empire had classified as low priority. Vasek leaned against the wall of his cell, closed his eyes, Let the sound wash over him. It sounded like a river.